Welcome to a brand new podcast series on coaching tools and approaches, brought to you by the Association for Coaching, the world's leading international professional body, which is advancing coaching in business and society worldwide. I'm your host, Claudia Day, coach and entrepreneur and co-founder of The Growing Coaches. Research shows that certain approaches can be effective. However, it also shows that integrating more than one approach can be even more effective. I will be in conversation with experts and look in more detail at some of these approaches, what the research says, how coaches can apply this in their practice, as well as some live demos to understand better how the approach is put into practice. Our aim in this series is to bring you closer to the research and information on a variety of approaches that you might like to put into practice. Welcome to Michael Cahill, trainer, coach, and facilitator with deep knowledge in systemic coaching and constellations, amongst others. Today we will talk about constellations, but before we get started, Michael, would you like to introduce yourself further to our listeners and tell us more of how you got here?
Thank you, Claudia. How I got here? Well, my original background, believe it or not, was in investment banking. I was an investment analyst for 16 years in the City of London. And after 16 years, I think which many people will recognise, you have those decisions in life where I didn't feel that the environment was one in which I belonged, and the values of the organisation were different to my values. And I left on very good terms. I wasn't going to a competitor. I was just leaving finance. And with no real idea what I was going to do next, I ended up setting up a financial training business. And when I was doing the training, I realised I needed to be a better trainer. And someone put me in touch with NLP, and I trained with ITS, Ian McDermott, in London, and got really, really interested in NLP. And that started my coaching journey. So a deep dive in NLP. I trained to be an NLP trainer. I trained in hypnosis. And if there's a path in that, I think I've always been interested in the unconscious mind part of NLP and the unconscious mind part of coaching, actually, because if we could resolve a problem consciously, we wouldn't need coaching. So what is happening in our unconscious mind was something that very, very much intrigued me. And so I deepened my knowledge of NLP. I became very interested in Nancy Kline's Time to Think, which some of the listeners may be familiar with. Nancy's work I really, really appreciate and think is a fantastic contribution to coaching. So I learned a lot through that. And I then, about 8 years ago, discovered systemic coaching and constellations, training with John Whittington. And that's been a real expansion of everything that's gone before. And it's really helped consolidate and integrate everything else. So it's been a journey through those various elements, all of which are still relevant, all of which I still use, because it's a convergence, if you will, into how I approach coaching today.
Thank you for that background. We might also need some financial training, but for today, we'll keep it to constellations. It's great to hear that when you talk about the unconscious mind as well, because I guess we don't refer to it very much throughout our daily and practice. And so it's nice to bring it up and keep that front of mind. With that in mind, and all your background, of course, we will focus today on constellations, and it would be great to have, if you could define for the audience what constellation means, what it involves, what does a coach who is practicing constellations do? So a bit of background for the listeners to get more related to this type of approach.
Yes, I think I'll explore a little about systemic coaching and constellations as we go, because I think that will be really useful. We all live and operate in different systems, and we have backgrounds in, the educational system, the system that is work. People may be parts of political systems or health systems, and so all of our lives we are connected with systems one way or another. And I think it's very interesting that when people come into coaching, it's the individual that's being coached. Whereas often the individual is merely manifesting something that is going on in the system. And so with this approach, we're trying to identify what is happening in the system that is producing this behaviour, rather than this being exclusively about an individual. And I find that's a very, very liberating way, and clients find it very liberating to appreciate that there are all these systemic influences and systemic forces happening. And of course, the system I didn't mention, which is where it all starts, of course, is the family system. You know, we all grew up in families. We all have the imprint of the way we were brought up in those family systems. And of course, our parents were brought up by their ancestors as well. And so when we're thinking about a systemic approach, it's just being mindful of the systems we are operating in and what the rules of belonging are in those systems. And if I may, I might share just a story which will flag some of the issues that might differentiate a systemic approach to an individual approach, and some of the underlying elements of systemic coaching and a constellation perspective. There's a systemic coach was working with a young lady who had changed job. I think it was something like 5 times in less than 5 years. And so he asked her a question, you know, and coaching obviously is all about questions, and we all love good coaching questions. But his coaching question was probably a little bit left field for some of us until we start thinking about things differently. And he asked her, "Did you grow up in an orphanage?" And it's a kind of strange question. So why did he ask that question? What was he thinking? And what was he driving at by looking at this question? Well, what he was trying to establish is the fact that there is a pattern here. Systemic coaching is really good when there's a repeating pattern. And so there's this repeating pattern of her leaving organizations after a relatively short period of time. The other dimension of this, as well as that repeating pattern, is that his intuition was that she had a problem with belonging. And belonging is one of the key central elements of systems. Because whilst often in the literature people will talk about it's our first and foremost kind of drive to survive, you know, so it's all about survival. Actually, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that the basic human need is to belong. We needed to belong in the tribe. We need to belong in the system, because otherwise we wouldn't survive. And so there's this notion of what does it take to belong in any particular system, and how good are we at recognizing belonging? And so his question was motivated by trying to understand this issue in terms of a past pattern. Because what conventional coaching will tend to do, and there's nothing wrong with this at the right time, is ask a question about the future. And what we've got here is an example of, actually, this is a repeating pattern. We need to establish, where did this pattern first start? So in systemic coaching, there's a slight difference in approach where we look to the past a little more, not in a therapeutic way, but merely to identify the origins of the pattern. And so hence this question, which may seem very odd at the outset, did you grow up in an orphanage? Because often if you're in an orphanage and you're moved around a lot, you would have had a childhood experience of not belonging. And that pattern of not belonging was being repeated in her adult self in organizational context. What was fascinating was that the client themselves thought this was a strange question and said, "That's a very odd question. No, I didn't grow up in an orphanage." But then realized, but oh my goodness, my father did. My father moved orphanage less than every year. And so he moved several times as a child. And this then illuminates another systemic pattern, that our behaviour always makes sense when you understand who or what we're being loyal to. So in her case, she's being loyal to her father because her father found it really difficult to belong when he was growing up, and probably throughout his life, given the impression, that early experience he had. Her way of showing loyalty and love to her father is to basically say, dear father, just like you, I won't belong either. And so this pattern of moving jobs is an echo, if you will, of his early experience, but it's her way of connecting. And of course, this would be completely out of her conscious awareness. And in systemic coaching and constellations, you would refer to that as a blind loyalty, because the work is very much about helping the client see the pattern, and so that they don't have to repeat it, because we want to honor the past in this work, not repeat it, because by doing that we can introduce agency and choice. And for all of us in coaching, whatever modality we're looking at, we are really trying to promote agency and choice for our clients.
Thank you for that. It gives us a bit of context and an idea of for a starting point. You mentioned there therapy, and of course, from what you are, the way you're describing constellations, there is a lot about identifying the pattern and going to the past. And as coaches, of course, we tend to look more to the future. And one of the ways to differentiate therapy and coaching is that one is future focused and the other one is more related to the past. So I guess in your experience and when you're training coaches, how do you train them on the lines, where to draw the line on that journey to try and discover the pattern, where it originates?
Yeah, it's a great question, and one that one has to be very sensitive to in terms of what permissions we have from the client. And I think there's a real difference between working systemically and in a constellation than with a therapeutic intervention, and both have their place. I think what there is a tendency, I think, in therapy is we go to the past and we explore it, and there can be a danger and it is a danger, that we end up exploring the story from the past. And here we're not, in a systemic sense, we're not interested in the story, we're interested in the pattern and staying out of the story. And so systemic work and a constellation, it's not a psychological intervention in the way that therapy is, and indeed some coaching modalities is. It's not a psychology. It's more of an applied philosophy. So we're just looking to see the pattern and to release the pattern rather than do any deep psychoanalytic explorations of it, So we're not necessarily exploring the Oedipus complex or anything like that necessarily. We're just looking at what's the pattern here and how can we honor that pattern and move on. Because, of course, this is what, you were asking about constellations. This is what a constellation does, is it illuminates the hidden patterns and connections in what's going on. Because as soon as we can see them, we can then do something different. So we're not going to analyze them to the nth degree. In fact, you don't really want to analyze it. You want to see it, and you want to see the pattern that's different, and you want to see, where did this pattern start? Is this pattern even mine? I was working with a client yesterday, and we were working systemically. It could very quickly have been therapeutic, but we kept on the systemic coaching side of things simply by illuminating the fact that a lot of these clients' patterns, like the story I've just shared, the client was taking responsibility for a lot of things that were going on that weren't hers to take responsibility for. And the pattern we identified is that she essentially, which is a common pattern I find, it's a common pattern for us coaches as well, is that we come from family systems where we've been looking after one or other parent. And we've taken on responsibilities of the parent that weren't ours to take on. and that was the pattern that was showing up there. So it was enough to illuminate it and to honour it, but not to go into the psychodynamics of that, the psychoanalysis of that. But it was just, I think, really important to flag up that this client was taking responsibilities for a lot of things that weren't hers. And of course, what's the issue? She's exhausted. Well, of course, if you're taking responsibility for everything, you're going to be exhausted. But you're absolutely right. There is this tendency in systemic coaching for our questions to be much more about where did this start? Or if you were working with in a team coaching context or an organizational context, rather than talking about, say, the 100-day plan for the new CEO or the new CFO, you would start with a systemic lens by saying, well, can you tell me about your predecessor? How did they leave? What happened? So you can see there is this orientation, because what we say with a systemic lens and frame is the past has precedence whilst the present has priority. So often when the client comes to you, a bit like the example of the orphanage I gave you, we could go into the future, but we needed to unlock the past first. We needed to just loosen that loyalty to her father's growing up in orphanages for her to go into the future. Otherwise, you go into the future with that pattern still unresolved. And in which case, from a coaching perspective, I think this is really fascinating. From a coaching perspective, that client in the orphanage case, she's more likely to repeat the pattern than to build her future. And in all coaching modalities, we're trying to encourage people to build their future, not repeat the past. With the systemic lens, we're trying to say, in which case we need to just look at that past first, see what the pattern is, allow it to dissolve, and now we can invite the client into the present moment, because I think that's another issue we may want to explore, is how important it is to stay in the present moment and build our future from there.
Yeah, that is something we definitely could explore more, which is once you identify the pattern, how do you move forward from there? But before we move there, we might want, maybe you can tell us more about the things that are important as a coach to consider besides belonging. So what are other concepts you feel are important for the coach to have in their minds when they're working with constellations?
Happily. The kissing cousin of belonging is loyalty. And so a really useful thing to be aware of, even if you don't want to go into constellations, but just something to hold in your awareness as a coach, is that if the client is really stuck and repeating the pattern, who or what are they being loyal to? Because that will explain the stuckness. So we need to identify the loyalty involved. That's just a really useful thing to be aware of. Because the loyalty, as in that case with the orphanage, to her father, you can honour the loyalties in other ways. You don't have to live the life they lived to be loyal. You can be loyal by living your own life in service and in honour of in that case, your father. You don't have to repeat their fate. So loyalty would be one. The systemic principles that we would really encourage your listeners to consider when thinking systemically is, we've talked about the first one, which is time, that the past has precedence, the present has priority, and just being aware of the fact that with a systemic lens, you'd probably spend a bit more time looking backwards than looking forwards compared to conventional coaching. So the other aspects of time is that whoever arrived in a system first has priority. That's known as the orders of time and the orders of joining. So in any system, whoever came first has a particularly special place in that system. So for those of your listeners who are working with teams or in organizations, it may well be, in that case, who were the founders of this organization, or who were the founders of this team? What was the original founding purpose? These are things that are really useful to be aware of, because they will be showing up in current issues that you may be working with as a coach. So that notion of time, who came first, is one of the first principles that we look at as systemic coaches. The other aspect to be aware of is place, that everybody and everything has to be in its right place. A system works so much more smoothly and effectively. And that's what we're talking about really in this session, is what creates healthy systems. And healthy systems, everybody has the right place, and everyone has the right to belong. And so what we are talking about here really is radical inclusion, that the most powerful element in a system in many respects is whatever it is that's being excluded. The energy of what's being excluded will still be very present in the system. And so again, when you're looking with a systemic lens and with a constellation, the question you're asking yourself is, what's been excluded here? What do we need to introduce? Because that's where the power is. Because all systems, to be healthy, want to move towards wholeness. They want to move towards completion. So on that basis, it's a process of radical inclusion. And so the other aspect then of systemic health is making sure that everybody has a place and everybody's been included. Now, what you might find in organizations is that in some organizations, you might find that there's been some behavior that's not been acceptable. Maybe it's been fraud, for example. And let's say it's a chief financial officer was in charge of a department. It got involved in something it shouldn't have got involved in. That person is often expelled from the system and never talked about again, because the behaviors were unacceptable. There's shame, possibly a degree of trauma for the organization. And so this person is excluded from the system. And that is very unhealthy for the system. And if we think about this in terms of something that underpins all systems are about joining, belonging, and leaving. And in that case, this person didn't leave well. Obviously, the circumstances weren't great. I accept that. But this person still was a part of the system, contributed to the system until their behaviors compromised their belonging in that system. And so they are still need to be included. And so, again, making sure that if you're just using a systemic lens, that this notion of leaving well and being remembered, because if the person who is excluded is never talked about, the system will still remember, member them, i.e. bring them back into belonging. And it may well be that the next person who replaces that person also commits the same crime as that other person. And that's how you get these sometimes repeating patterns in organizations. And again, just having that lens of where did this start, we need to re-include this person. We need to remember them. And that's not to say that everything they did was good, but they do need to be remembered. And that can also be true of events in organizational life, that there may be major restructurings that the management team don't want to talk about because it was so painful. But those people who left are very important. They may have given 15, 20 years of service. And so for them to not be remembered now is actually really upsetting and deeply upsetting for them. And furthermore, if you think about it for those that remain in the system, if they're thinking of it, they'll go, oh, this could happen to me, that I'm expelled from the organization and never talked about again. That's what happens here. In which case, you've got very little chance of psychological safety within the remaining team members or organizational membership. And so you'll never get great performance if that fundamental human need of psychological safety has been compromised. So we've talked about the principle of time. We've talked about the principle of place. The other principle that underpins healthy systems is the balance of exchange, which basically means that there has to be a fair and appropriate balance of exchange between people in the system and between the system and the members of it. And so, in a way, if you like, at a human level, I think this is the human need to be fully seen and fully recognised, both for who you are and what you do, as well as receiving an appropriate salary for the work that you do. And so, with the balance of exchange, you're always trying to work out, is this a fair and appropriate balance of exchange? Are people being recognised for all the work they do? Are they being paid for that? Are they being acknowledged for it? And if not, what can happen? And I don't know how the listeners are with this, but I'm finding a lot of my clients are really on the edge of burnout, if not in burnout. And burnout would be a classic example of the balance of exchange being wrong. That we are giving to the system and we are working really, really hard, but don't feel valued or recognised or rewarded appropriately. And so the balance of exchange, again, I think is key. It's a key issue to understand. Again, we need to look at our own patterns, who's overgiving in the system and who in the system may not be giving enough. So even at a more prosaic level for your listeners, what's the balance of exchange in the coaching contract? Am I being paid appropriately and being recognised appropriately for the work I'm doing here? When I started coaching, I'd often price myself at a very low level, or I would do it pro bono or what have you. And the balance of exchange was never quite right because I wasn't being valued and compensated for the quality I was bringing to the exchange. And often I would find, actually, I've had more difficulty with clients where I was giving them the coaching than for those who are actually paying me properly for it. And I'm sure that's something to do with the balance of exchange, that not charging the client, I didn't know this then, but not charging the client really affected the balance of exchange adversely, made me too big. And again, it's been much easier if that's kind of, if you like, part of the discussion. What's an appropriate balance of exchange here? So if you like, as well as belonging and loyalty, the three systemic principles to be aware of are time, who came first, place, who belongs here, who's been excluded that we need to remember, and the balance of exchange. So those are the things we would share as kind of things that support systemic health for the individual and for teams and organizations. So I think, this is, really useful for those of us involved working with individuals and I suspect especially teams, in team coaching, being aware of these dynamics is particularly important.
Thank you for that. It at some point, made me think of a spiral and going a bit deeper, I guess, from the surface of the end of the spiral. So I'm guessing, we can stay a lot of time in the theory. It sounds like an approach where the coach having knowledge about how groups works and systems work is very important for the approach itself. Can you tell us a bit about the research in this area and what research is out there to support constellations?
Yes, I can. I think that it's a good question in as much as it's not a science as such. And so there's not a lot of statistical empirical data to underpin it. There's just years and years of observation. So it would be known as the kind of the phenomenology of this, observing what happened in constellations. And it was built upon by Bert Hellinger, looking at families and family systems. That's the origin of the work. It was subsequently adapted in organizational and other contexts. But it emerged out of looking at family systems and what creates health and the flow of energy and the flow of love in family systems. And there's been, lots of, it is empirical in the sense that it's observation based, but these are the patterns that occurred whenever Bert Hellinger was doing constellations. These were the things that he was noticing that either restored flow in the system and led to well-being, or undermined flow. Because obviously what I was just saying, the violation of belonging, the violation of time, place and exchange causes stuckness in the system rather than flow. So the evidence is much more constellations being done in practice over many years by many people, and the body of knowledge building and changing, depending upon what we observe as being true in the system. And so it is one of those things, and Hellinger made this wonderful point about truth. And I think this is why we would call this work an applied philosophy rather than applied psychology, is that the body gets stronger in the presence of truth. And so he would say that it's very difficult to define the truth, but very easy to feel it. And so our body tends to get stronger when the truth is spoken. And so all of the evidence supporting constellation work is something from our phenomenological experience of what's true, what makes the system stronger, what restores flow to the system. And so there's been a lot of evidence there. There's been studies done of it. And of course, it's an unusual element that these constellations work and reveal the hidden dynamics of what's going on in a system. And there's all sorts of aspects of that that are sort of out of our everyday awareness. And you just think, how on earth did that happen? And of course, that's because there's all of this energy, and we call it the field, is that you're really tuning into field energy. And the scientific research on that really would be, you're into the realm of quantum physics, that the energy can never be destroyed. We're tuning into energy. And so if you were thinking about evidence for this, and also how it relates to other coaching modalities, is that it's really the information in our body that we're using rather than rational cognitive. So when I was talking about the unconscious mind in the introduction, this work is highly unconscious in the sense that we are using our body to pick up the information in a constellation. Or when we're coaching, our body lets us know what is going on in the field between us and the client. And so this would have a lot of overlaps with Gestalt coaching, with somatic coaching, be in very, very similar territory to those approaches, perhaps with just some adjustments because of the systemic principles, but they'd be very close, and also close to a lot of NLP-based interventions as well.
I love that phrase of the body gets stronger in the presence of truth. And I guess, of course, in coaching, we know that awareness is key, a key factor for moving forward. Michael, would you like to do a demo for us on how to coach with using constellations?
Let's see how we go. And it may be a constellation, it may just be we have a conversation to see what the elements might be.
So I guess it would be interesting that because it is such a deep approach, it was difficult to find a topic to suit this type of coaching. So the one that came to mind was struggling with chit chat with the neighbors when joining a gym and, starting there and struggling with that. I'm a sociable person. I tend to relate to people, but how with that chit chat or quick talks, or I struggle more to relate to people and connect. I would say connection is probably what I'm looking for. A little bit of connection during those interactions rather than just the superficial, hi, how are you? Or hi, and nothing else. And so at some point I pinpointed it to, I'm always in a rush. So maybe it's that, I don't take the time to stop and talk to people and ask more questions. Then I was like, oh, maybe I don't remember the last thing that was relevant or that we spoke a little bit. And so should I remember? And I've been, as you can see, it's something I've been trying to improve over the years, how to connect with people even on those short interactions rather than only on longer interactions.
And so there's an interesting array of issues and ways we can go down here. I'm intrigued. A piece that struck me and I felt in my body when you said it was, I'm always in a rush. That struck me as, because if you're always in a rush, there'll be no time for chit chat or connection. And when you're in that rush, how connected are you to yourself, let alone connected to another person? And so I'm just curious about that. Is it about the chit chat, or is it about the fact that you have a tendency to always be in a rush?
So I at some point attributed it to rush, but and that may be sometimes the issue for it, but I don't think that's the underlying. I don't think that's the issue, because even when I'm not in a rush, I still, like, let's say a neighbor brought a package to me yesterday, as an example, and that they received from Amazon. This is a neighbor who I have had chit chats with several times over the past 3 weeks. There I was receiving the package, saying, thank you, how was the day? Good. And then that awkward silence, which I get a lot. And then me sort of wondering, what can I ask next? How to do this? And then just thank you for the package. Have a lovely evening. Bye. And, just retrieving because of more safety, I guess.
Yeah. Do you have a sense of when this first started, this issue with chit chat, and also that notion of awkward silence? Because you indicated that happens a lot.
So when I started being more aware of it would be when you start with kids, dropping them off in school and picking them up in school, because there you are exposed continually to parents who then, and I guess I also saw other parents who just naturally were more conversational, and through the years. So I felt uncomfortable. It was a time where I felt uncomfortable, but then I went with another mom who just spoke to the whole school type of thing. And it's not that I want to be the parent who speaks to the whole school, but it was a nice feeling of, oh, wow, she really connects with everybody and knows, and really quickly gets to connect with the other parents. So I would think probably that's the first place I remember, the first time I really remember it. I'm trying to think back to early years of work, when I used to, when I started working as a consultant, traveling to different countries, companies. Would I have had there some of that? But it's not something that it started bothering more. It started bothering me with the school pickups and drop-offs.
Mm-hmm. And if this situation was a little more resolved for you, how would you be feeling differently?
On my daily life, I wouldn't have that. Every day I have this, because every day I will see people coming in and out of places. And I wouldn't have that uncomfortable 5 minutes. And I guess my day would be nicer if I didn't have those uncomfortable periods.
And if your day was nicer and you didn't have those uncomfortable periods, how would you be feeling differently? Sorry,
the thought that came to mind was, of course, when I have Zoom meetings, it doesn't happen. And I was trying to think why in a meeting I wouldn't necessarily, and I guess it's because the meeting again, there is duration there. The meeting usually starts with a chit chat, but then moves on into something else. But I don't think it happens in the same way as it does with a face-to-face. And in terms of how it would be different, my day would be different if I didn't have these uncomfortable moments, is I guess that those would bring joy. So rather than it being, oh my God, let me navigate this 5 minutes quickly or see how I, figure it out, it would be joy, because connection brings joy. So it's more about, there are nice people out there, and that I see on a daily basis, and I can learn from people. Something might have happened. There is more that I could bring more joy to other people's life. Like there's that unfulfilled potential of what those interactions could bring that they don't.
Yeah. And if you were bringing joy to other people's lives, how would you be feeling different as a person?
More complete.
Well, that's a lovely systemic answer. More complete. And so what I've really just been doing there is just to kind of get a sense of the issue, and if the issue were a little more resolved, if we were working systemically, I don't know how much time we've got, but we could then start looking at your relationship to the resources that would support you in having the chit chat. Now, what I would observe is, of course, is that you've worked out the answer anyway, is that when you're in a Zoom meeting, you can do chit chat very easily. And to map that skill across, that's more of an NLP technique. But, the fact that you know how to do chit chat is really important information, because it's just applying that capability that you clearly have on Zoom into the context of seeing another mother or father at the school gate. It's almost like that could be, if you just thought of that as the start of a meeting, and it's only going to be the start of a meeting, you've got that connection and joy. So the upside is pretty considerable, it seems to me, that, you really get that connection and joy. And the way I would tend to go here, I think, and there'd be all sorts of ways, I think all sorts of conventional coaching modalities would also be able to work with this too. But it's also just what would resource you in that moment of chit chat, and it might be that we, if we were to map it out as a constellation, we might put a marker down for chit chat. We might put a marker down for connection, put a marker down for joy. These are the things that would be represented in your constellation. And clearly, I'm just doing this as an overview, really. With a client, I'd be kind of also finding out what you would like to have represented in this map to see your relationship with chit chat.
I guess for the benefit of the audience, because we have until now covered a lot on looking at the past, and then there is now the how do you work the future, as in how do you move on from there. I guess for the benefit of the audience, it would be nice to get a bit more of a perspective on what you mean by mapping joy and connection and.
Yeah, thank you. That's really useful. What I mean by that is just creating a space on the floor, and you might even just draw on an A4 piece of paper something like chit chat and place it on your floor, and then you might do another one for connection. And I would invite you then to stand in relationship, so we get an embodied sense of what your relationship with chit chat is. And we get an embodied relationship with joy. And you're absolutely right. How do we then take it into the future is, well, your body would have an experience of how your relationship with chit chat might change when it's resourced by that knowing that the connection would be different, that there would be joy in your daily life. You'd be bringing joy to others. And so it would be basically kind of getting that map and just getting your felt sense of what it's like to stand in relationship to chit chat. So if you were standing in relationship to chit chat and it was difficult, we would find out, well, what might resource you in having those conversations that we know you can have on Zoom. So we'd be finding out the resources you have to bring to this. So in the future, of course, the encouragement would be, is step into your resources. And again, that would be familiar with many coaching patterns that, it's the resources that when we're connected to the resources that we have and that you clearly have, just not in this context. And then, the invitation would be, well, if you step into that resource of connection and you know that connection brings joy, what would it be like? Imagine that, tomorrow you're taking your children to school and you meet one of the parents. How would you meet them and have chit chat with them tomorrow, knowing that you can bring joy to their life by connecting with them through joy?
I'll share basically, and that brings us nicely to the next question as well. So when you were talking about standing on the floor, putting the paper on the floor for chit chat and for connection, I immediately went to the side of connection, and chit chat was there, almost facing backwards. And so I realized, there is something about that name chit chat that just creates the chills, like almost like a cat, when it goes into that position. And connection brings joy. So it made me think, what is it with connection? And of course, there's something about being authentic. And so there was, what if rather than going and doing chit chat, it's more about being authentic, and what does it mean to be authentic? I also started reflecting about when I'm in a Zoom chat, I know who it is that I'm talking to probably. When I'm about to enter the school, I never know who I'm going to meet. So there's also that factor of not knowing. And the question that came up is, do I open more on a Zoom chat because it's on a one-to-one, it's a safe space, so it feels safer? Do I open more than I do on a school courtyard, or in a place where you meet someone? So that was another question that I had, and so questions for me too. But this brings us nicely to the next question, which is technology. And technology has, of course, impacted a lot the way we coach nowadays, and we're coaching mostly remotely. So for these interventions where there is a spatial component to the actual approach, in some instances, how has technology impacted? How has it benefited, hindered, and how have you gotten around that side, that difficult or that challenge to not being able to necessarily draw on a piece of paper and see what the person is drawing or where the person is standing?
Well, two things on that. I think lockdown and the pandemic has seen most of us move online some way or another, and constellation work has also moved online, and it's been really inspiring to see that constellations still work online, even though we're all in our Zoom boxes or whatever we're on. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is that we can send the client a map where they could map these things so the client can see it. Again, using the technology, there's a digital kit where you can show the constellation, if you will, that you're working on, and share your screen with me so I can see your map, I can see your constellation as you work on it and you place these things on the screen. I work a lot by literally getting people, because I don't need to see them, but in this instance, you would write down chit chat, joy, connection, possibly authenticity as another one, and place them on your floor in a place that feels true to you. And you would just report to me. I don't need to see you, but you would just report back. And I've worked very, very well in that way. The reason I like doing it that way is it gets the client up and moving and in their body. Because I think what can happen with conventional coaching, it can be very head-based and people can get stuck. But just getting people up and standing and moving in the different locations, because all of these different locations have different energies. And it really does produce, in a very short time, it can produce some real insights into the issue the client has. And so even though we're doing it over Zoom, I don't need to see the person. I need to know what they're feeling. So as long as they can report back to me what's going on in each location, and I'm trying to get the unconscious information, i.e. the information from the body. And so it with technology, this still works. It's different than in the room. In the room, there's arguably more, because you've got all the non-verbals of the whole body in the room compared to just the top half, as it were. But nonetheless, the technology really works and in the room really works. And I also think just sometimes the kind of principles I was exploring at the beginning is just a very good holding lens for your conventional, the way you coach normally. Just having that awareness of some of the systemic dynamics and patterns in itself is just very useful online. And because what we would say with systemic coaching and constellations, it's not a tool, it's a tool bag to hold all your other modalities, all your other ways of working, because they're all still valid. The example you brought could have been many coaching modalities could have worked very successfully with that, as well as a systemic approach. But just holding that all, the coaching and constellations approach is very much a tool bag to hold all your other tools and techniques, rather than it being a tool in itself.
Yeah, I can see that, how you would then apply the different tools. So I'm just thinking that for the benefit of the audience, it might be nice for us to close that picture of authenticity. You just included authenticity so that they can see how to move forward, to finish moving forward once you start working with constellations. And they get also the other side of the picture of working with constellation. And I guess the question I had about this is, in this instance, you chose to map out the different emotions plus the actual problem, which is the chit chat. You could have also chosen to map out me with the parents in the school. So the actual characters or the people involved.
I could have done,
and I'm guessing there are other things that you could have chosen to map out. So how do you choose what to map out?
Normally, I would have let you choose. I was just trying to keep the conversation going by just suggesting things. But normally you'd invite the client to say what needs to be represented in the map. What I found is that the things like connection and joy and being authentic just seem to be really resonant resources for you. And I just felt that you having an experience of standing in your resources of connection, joy, and being authentic would give you a totally different way of approaching chit chat. So rather than it being about the parents per se, it was about resourcing you for the chit chat. Now, I could have gone the other way. The other way I could have gone, of course, is to ask, who are you being loyal to in behaving this way? Is this a pattern that maybe your parents are not very good at chit chat? But again, to keep it simple, I didn't do that. And I just wanted to give you the opportunity to stand in the resources that would support you, because it was really quite touching, this notion that connection brings joy, and your delight in bringing joy into other people's lives. It just seemed, let's map that then. How good would it be for you to stand in the energy of those elements? So that was the intention behind that. And you're right to do this piece of it, because to get a felt sense of it in your body, of how it feels to stand in those places of connection and joy, is very different to you talking about it. Your body will feel very differently.
Makes sense. Let me just rip the paper and I'll put it on the floor.
Please do.
And I think that's important for the audience to know, that you could have mapped different things.
Absolutely. Yes, the important thing is when you're mapping is to be respectful and playful. And so there isn't a prescribed thing to map.
Well, you mentioned playful, and I was about to actually say, the second I started writing and cutting the pieces of paper and putting them in the floor, etc., it changed completely my whole feeling about it, and more playful. It added that playful component to it, which I guess if you're in a session where you need to change the energy, it's a good thing to have, a good resource to have.
It bringing you into your body and into your playfulness, which is a different state than just talking about it. And this is an important part of the work, is to shift clients from their head to the body and the wisdom of the body.
I put them all separate because they don't seem to really... So when I think of connection, it feels different to authentic. Even though I create a connection by being authentic, they feel the closest, I guess. And then if I think about joy, I would also bring it close to those three. And then I am conscious chit chat is there, and I do want to bring it closer, even though it's far away. I am going to put it.
Just leave it where it is for the time being.
Okay. Well, it doesn't feel right there anymore. It felt right there at the start when we started talking about it, but now it feels better. It's still, for the audience, it's still not with the other three. It's still the furthest away from all the other three.
But your relationship has changed already with chit chat.
Yes, because I'm actually behind. I'm now behind chit chat, facing everything forward. So everything is in front of me, whereas before it was behind me.
And how are you feeling in your body right now?
A bit more manageable, as in something I am about to embrace rather than something I am running away from. It still doesn't feel downhill.
Okay.
It's not that it feels like an easy thing,
no.
But at least it feels something, like when you're about to go up a mountain and you're feeling, I can remember it brings me back to, you're skiing and at the end of the day, you're tired. You have your skis on your shoulder and you have to go up the mountain, but you're okay to do it. You have the energy to do it, even though you're tired, or you find the energy.
And so where are you standing now?
Right beside chit chat. So chit chat is.
Okay. And if you were to step back and if you were to stand on, for example, connection, so stand on the mark of connection and just let your body to tune into connection and all that means for you.
Well, connection is very close to authenticity. And when somehow the part that puts me more uncomfortable is the authentic part, the having to be authentic.
Okay. So stay in connection a little bit longer and just see what happens in your body as you connect with connection.
It's a nice feeling. Equal.
Mm-hmm. And where are you feeling that in your body?
Here.
Oh, nice.
When I say here for the audience, it's the chest area. So like when you're equal to someone.
You're equal to someone and you're connecting from your chest area. It also looks to me like it's your heart. The heart is all about connection.
Yeah, definitely this area.
And with all of that energy of connection, if you were to stand in joy.
Head to toe.
Head to toe.
Yeah.
Head to toe. And you're looking very different in this place.
It's very focused towards joy, and it's somehow
for the benefit of those who can't see it.
It's somehow like not focusing on the other ones. When I came to joy, I was standing in front of joy, and it was only joy there.
Yeah, and you light up. Your face lights up in that space. It's a very different energy. And again, it's just, for the benefit of people listening, the important thing is just how different these spaces are energetically. Your body is very different in each place, isn't it?
My left eye and my right eye. So my left eye when I'm here and my right eye when I was in connection is always going to authentic. I don't know why.
Well, that may be very. So with those experiences of connection and joy, what would it be like to step into authenticity now, or into being authentic now? Forgive me.
With connection and joy, it's fast. It's easy. It's without the connection that it's a bit more challenging to go into authentic.
So that's a useful thing to be aware of, isn't it? That the sequence for you is connection, joy, and then authentic.
Yeah.
It appears to be.
Yeah. I would almost say joy, connection, and then authentic. So it's almost like the joy needs to be there for everything to be easy.
Yeah. Joy needs to be there for everything to be easy.
Even chit-chat.
And so what's your relationship with chit-chat like now from this place where joy needs to be there for everything to be easy?
Well, I feel it needs to come forward, but if I think about it, it needs to be like on one side of joy is the chit-chat one. So, and on the other side, then it's authentic and connection. And then I think to myself, well, but I have a hypothesis that I cannot do chit-chat, good chit-chat without authentic. I may be wrong. It may be that I cannot do good chit-chat without joy.
And so what would it be like to approach chit-chat with a sense of joy and connection?
I almost feel like trying. There's this video that when I'm in the morning and I can't wake up, there's this video that cheers me up. And I'm just wondering, can I play that video before I'm about to walk that that path towards the entry of the school. Can I just look at that video and sort of, it's some kids dancing, and so, some dancing. So I wonder if that could, doing something that brings me joy before going to do chit chat, if that could then translate to also joy in chit chat.
Well, I think that's an important point, isn't it?
I also wonder if changing the name of chit chat.
Exactly. It's the energy with which you approach chit chat. So if you're in the energy of joy and you approach chit chat, your connection with yourself will be different, and your connection with the person you're chit chatting with will be different.
Can I sit down again, or do you want me to stay here?
Yeah, please do.
So it could be connecting to parents rather than chit chat, or something like that.
Yeah. Well, that feels very different, doesn't it? Connecting to parents. Because if chit chat is just a form of connecting, it's got a very different sense to it, hasn't it?
Thank you for that. It was actually, I'll definitely try and change some of the things. I play around with it, I guess, during pick up and drop off, and think more of connection or authentic. I think even more than connection, it's thinking of being authentic. And I guess when I meet people in Zoom, I give them some of myself, as in what's really happening, rather than, oh, fine. So I guess I could try a bit more of that and see how it goes.
Good luck with it.
Michael, it would be great to hear as well for which types of topics this would be appropriate or best to use in a coaching session.
That's a good question. I think, as I said earlier, one of the key things for coaches thinking of applying mapping or constellation, I think the first two things I would say is, one, as said earlier, where there's a repeating pattern that the client can't get beyond, that's a really good time to look at it differently through using constellation work and embodied work and somatic work. That would be one instance where this approach, I think, offers something fresh and will really change the perspective on the issue. Related to that, I think there's a sense of, if you've got a client, and many of us have, who are in their head and going around in circles a little bit, and they're not moving out of their head, as the demo showed, getting the client into their body, getting the client moving. Because clients come into coaching for many reasons, but one of the key reasons is that they're stuck. So actually getting them up and moving and realizing how much information and intelligence is in their body is in itself really useful. Of course, conventionally, constellations would be there to show relationship dynamics. How am I getting on? I'm not getting on with my boss, and mapping that out, getting a really good sense of how the map looks, the distance and direction. So those relationships where you need a fresh perspective as well. It could be with the boss. It could be with people who report to you. It could be how a team are relating. What's the dynamic? So if you think the guiding principle here is, where can we illuminate what's hidden? What's the dynamic that we need to see and map out? So in my relationship with my boss, or, if it's personal coaching, it may be, my relationship with my partner. I just want to look at something because it's not quite well, put it on a map. And that will always reveal, at the very least, some key information that the client hasn't noticed before, because they're externalizing it. That what they're telling you in their head gets put outside of their head onto the map. And that's just so powerful, because people often have not seen it so clearly because they've been carrying it in their head. So those are some of the situations. Of course, one of the things with team coaching that I think is interesting is, of course, we all have an inner team. So, the parts of us, one of the things that I map a lot with clients is their relationship between their head brain, their heart brain, and their gut brain. They all perform very different functions. And some of us have very strong preferences. I tend to lead with my head. Other people will lead with their heart. So actually mapping out the head, heart, and gut brains is fantastically useful in coaching and coaching clients, particularly if you think about it with respect to something like decision making. Because when we make a decision, we need all of those intelligences to support the decision. Because if you take a decision, but your heart's not involved, it's not going to be a great decision, because the heart is the seat of your values. And we know from all coaching modalities that values should drive decisions. So how can we include our heart in decision making would be a great thing to map out as part of your inner team. And similarly, there may be a part of us that wants to do something and a part of us that doesn't want to do something. Externalizing it and just looking at the relationship will again give you fresh insight into that dynamic between those inner parts of you and who you are.
Lovely. I like that. Is there anything else you want to leave the listeners with?
No, I just hope you've enjoyed exploration of systemic coaching and constellations. And if you are interested in exploring it further, coachingconstellations.com has some ways in which you can approach and deepen your knowledge of this. And if you feel drawn to it, hopefully we'll meet along the path.
Where can our listeners find out? Well, you've just said the webpage, but is there anything else you would recommend for them, a book or something? And how can they get in touch with you?
In terms of the book, John Whittington's Coaching and Constellations book is a great place to start. The third edition. I emphasize the third edition because there's some additions to that which are really, really powerful and useful.
Perfect. And how can the audience get in touch with you?
My email address is michael@coachingconstellations.com.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Michael. That was very deep. As in, I feel constellation somehow takes you deeper in the exploration, and it was interesting to go through that journey with you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to another episode by the Association for Coaching. I have been Claudia Day. We hope this episode offers you some new insight and inspiration. For 20 years, our purpose has been to inspire and champion coaching excellence, advance the coaching profession, and make a sustainable difference to individuals, organizations, and society. To find out more about the AC and our member benefits, follow us on LinkedIn or explore our webpage at associationforcoaching.com. There, you can keep up to date with our latest episodes, enjoy the wealth of digital learning offerings, and gain insights from our Coaching Perspectives magazine.